My husband made our daughter call him uncle. So his first love would never know we existed. Our daughter gave him 100 forgiveness coupons. And he told her to tear one up whenever he chose another little girl over her. On her 6th birthday, only 3 remained. The fireworks she thought were for her spelled out someone else's name. Alexander seemed to notice that I no longer tried to stop him. Whenever he made excuses to accompany Charlotte, Clark, and her daughter. Even our daughter, Kimberly Morrison, no longer cried or threw tantrums. The moment he stepped toward the door, our daughter picked up a forgiveness coupon and asked him carefully, "Uncle Alex, can you not go see them today and stay home with Mom and me instead?" Alexander didn't stop walking. His voice drifted back from the doorway, carrying a hint of approach and urgency. "Kimmy, be good. Pearl is sick and I need to take care of her. You still have so many coupons left anyway. Just tear this one up. It doesn't matter. Remember to forgive me after you use it." Kimmy's eyes turned red as she tore the coupon in her hands into pieces and threw it in the trash, looking at the table with only 2 forgiveness coupons remaining. I knew the day we would leave wasn't far away. After Alexander left, Kimmy stared at the door for a long time, her light brown eyes filled with hurt tears. But she refused to let a single drop fall. I walked over and hugged her, wanting to take her back to the living room. But Kimmy grabbed the corner of my shirt and looked up at me with a tearful voice, asking, "Mom, why doesn't Uncle Alex like me? Am I not a good girl?" Her words and the sadness in her voice made my nose sting, and I almost cried too. I ruffled her soft hair and said, "Kimmy, you're my most well-behaved treasure. Uncle Alex doesn't dislike you either. It's just that someone's sick and Uncle Alex went to help them." Kimmy nodded and didn't ask any more questions. I knew she hadn't accepted this answer, but rather that she didn't want me to be sad too. I carried her to the dining table and brought out the cake we had baked together that morning to celebrate her 6th birthday. After lighting the candles, Kimmy was about to make a wish when the sound of fireworks suddenly came from outside the window. Then Alexander's voice rang out from the large screen by the river. He stood in the center of the screen, his expression gentle as he said, "Today is a special little girl's birthday. I want to wish her a happy birthday here tonight. All the fireworks in the city are set off for her." Hearing Alexander's words, Kimmy's eyes, which had been fixed on the big screen, immediately lit up with her face full of excitement. She hugged my leg and said with a laugh, "Mom, Uncle Alex still remembers my birthday. Didn't forget." I smiled and touched her hair. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement as she held a green piece of paper and said, "Mom, for my wish this year, I want to give today's forgiveness coupon back to Uncle Alex. He went to help someone, but he still remembered my birthday. I shouldn't have torn up the coupon." The fireworks went off precisely at the stroke of midnight, but the words spelled out by those fireworks pierced both mine and Kimmy's eyes like daggers. "Dearest Pearl, happy 5th birthday. Love from Daddy, Alexander." In the thundering sounds of fireworks, Kimmy threw away the forgiveness coupon in her hand and tossed the remaining 2 coupons into the trash can. "I never want to forgive Uncle Alex again." She said this and ran back to her room. When I went to her room, she had already curled up on her little bed and fallen asleep. Her cheeks were streaked with tears, and she clutched a photo of our family at the amusement park tightly in her arms. Kimmy treasured this photo and would take it out to look at from time to time. It was the only picture we had of our family of 3 at an amusement park after Alexander bought the entire amusement park as a birthday gift for Pearl because she said she liked it. Kimmy never mentioned wanting to go to an amusement park again. I put the photo away for her, wiped the tears from her face, and let her rest. Next morning, I contacted a divorce lawyer and asked her to help me draft a divorce agreement. However, after I finished the phone call, Kimmy peeked her head out from behind the door. I waved her over, and she immediately walked in and hugged my legs, fighting back the bitterness in my heart. I asked her, "Sweetheart, if Mom divorces Uncle Alex, would you rather stay with Uncle Alex or come with Mom?" Kimmy's arms around me stiffened. She lowered her head, her voice carrying tears and reluctance. "Do we really have to leave, Mom? Uncle Alex promised that once I turned 7, he'll let me call him Dad. Can we wait a little longer? Can we give him one more chance?" Kimmy's words made my chest tighten, and I almost started crying. During our years of marriage, Alexander had refused to make our relationship public to avoid Charlotte's misunderstanding. But even worse, our daughter wasn't allowed to call him Dad from the day she was born. I remembered one time when Kimmy gathered courage to call him Dad. He flew into a rage right there and made her kneel at the front door, forcing her to shout, "Uncle Alex," 3,000 times until her voice was nearly gone. Since then, whether at home or outside, Kimmy never dared call him dad again. Only Uncle Alex. After saying this, she picked up the forgiveness coupons she had thrown in the trash yesterday and said, "Mom, look, there's still one coupon left. Let's give him one more chance." Kimmy's eyes, red and swollen from crying, were full of determination. I ruffled her hair and sighed, agreeing to her request. Alexander hadn't come home since that day. Kimmy brought me an invitation, her eyes hopeful as she said, "Mom,
the teacher said
both parents need to attend the parent-teacher conference at school. Can you and Uncle Alex come together? I promised my classmates they could meet my dad." I held the invitation with some doubt, looking at the expectation in Kimmy's eyes. I couldn't bear to disappoint her, but I wasn't sure if Alexander would actually go. After all, in our 5 years of marriage, he had never attended any of Kimmy's parent-teacher conferences. For promising Kimmy, I called Alexander to confirm. However, a young voice answered the phone.
"Hello?
"Are you looking for Daddy, Alexander? He's taking a shower and will be out soon." My nails dug into my palm to keep from lashing out. I coldly hung up the phone. Just as I was about to tell Kimmy that Alexander couldn't make it, he called back. "Isabella, girl's young and can't tell the difference between Uncle Alex and Daddy."
So she called me the wrong thing. Just don't misunderstand.
"Kimmy's my only precious daughter." He sounded rather pathetic trying to explain himself. In such a panic, I no longer wanted to pursue these matters. Fidgeting with the last remaining forgiveness coupon in my hand, I asked him coldly, "Are you coming to Kimmy's parent-teacher conference?" Alexander was about to speak, but I cut him off. "You've already missed her birthday. Are you going to miss her parent-teacher conference too?" Alexander paused, and after a long while he said, "I'll go. I'll definitely go this time." "Is Kimmy mad at me? Can you help me explain?" I had no interest in his long explanations. After getting a definite answer, I ended the call.
Kimmy,
who was beside me, saw me nod and jumped up happily. Even though there were still several days until the parent-teacher conference, she had already started preparing what clothes she would wear. On the day of the parent-teacher conference, Kimmy got up early and asked me to braid her hair nicely. He also put on her favorite outfit. Her eyes were bright and sparkling, and she was full of smiles. Looking at her, so full of anticipation, I felt a knot of anxiety forming in my chest. I took out my phone and texted Alexander. "Alexander, don't forget. You promised to attend Kimmy's parent-teacher conference today soon." Alexander sent back a voice message. "You and Kimmy go ahead. I'll be there soon." In the background, I could hear Pearl calling Alexander Daddy
and Charlotte Mommy.
Sure enough, he was once again deceiving us. For Charlotte and her daughter, all that talk about working overtime at the company was just an excuse to spend time with those two. If this were before, I would have definitely fought with him and made a scene. But now I only reminded him coldly, "If you disappoint Kimmy again, this time she won't forgive you anymore." After saying that, I drove with my daughter to her school without waiting for his reply. The parent-teacher conference was about to start, but Alexander still hadn't arrived. Kimmy kept looking toward the door, hoping her dad would walk through it any second. Watching Kimmy stare at the door like that, I texted Alexander to urge him to come quickly. He told me there was a sudden emergency at the company, and that he couldn't attend the conference.
Ifraned.
Trying to figure out how to explain this to Kimmy without hurting her. When I saw her looking toward the classroom door, her face had turned deathly pale. Following her gaze, I saw Alexander, who had said he was too busy to come to the parent-teacher conference, striding into the classroom, initially thinking he was planning to surprise Kimmy. My furrowed brow relaxed. I was about to wave him over, when I saw Charlotte tightly holding his arm beside him, while he held Charlotte's daughter, Pearl, closely in his arms. The three of them looked like an intimate family. My raised arms suddenly stiffened and dropped. Alexander didn't see me and Kimmy. He sat down naturally with Pearl in his arms, and Charlotte beside him in the seats meant for Pearl's parents. I quickly looked at my daughter, and she was keeping her head down tightly, and on the previously dry desk there was now a small puddle of water. I put my arm around her, about to comfort her, when several little boys suddenly appeared beside her. They surrounded Kimmy and said, "Kimberly Morrison, didn't you say you'd bring your dad today? Where's your dad? I think you were just lying. So you're just a bastard with no father."
"Kimberly, you're such a liar."
Kimmy kept her head down, her ears turning bright red. She suddenly lifted her head, revealing a pair of red swollen eyes, and shouted, "I do have a dad. You're the bastard with no dad." After saying this, Kimmy pointed her finger forcefully toward Alexander and shouted with all her might, "Uncle Alex, over there is my dad." Kimmy's words caused an instant uproar in the classroom. The other parents' eyes kept darting between me, Charlotte and Alexander. The classroom was suddenly filled with all kinds of ridiculous speculations. Seeing Kimmy's and Alexander's strikingly similar faces, everyone began to guess that Charlotte and Pearl were the mistress and illegitimate daughter. And today I caught them red-handed. As the discussions grew louder and louder, Pearl immediately began to tear up and said, "This is my daddy, not yours. Kimberly, it's bad enough that you bully me at school every day, but this is my daddy, not yours." I was about to speak when Kimmy grabbed tightly onto the corner of my shirt. As her mother, I knew that she didn't want me to speak. Her tear-filled eyes stared intently at Alexander. However, at that moment, Alexander stood unhesitatingly on Pearl's side, acting as if he had never known Kimmy. His voice was stern and reproachful. "Whose child are you? How can you bully other kids? Come over here and apologize to Pearl." With these words, he immediately distanced himself from Kimmy and me. He also completely cleared Charlotte and Pearl of the accusations of being a mistress and an illegitimate daughter. Hearing Alexander's words, I was instantly furious and wanted to confront him. However, Kimmy suddenly spoke up, her voice tearful and small. "I'm sorry, Uncle Alex." Then she threw herself into my arms and said, "Mom, I want to go home. Can you take me home?" Kimmy's condition made me unable to care about anything else. I held her and left that place that made her so uncomfortable. On the way back, Kimmy threw the last forgiveness coupon out the car window. That green forgiveness coupon was swept up by the wind and disappeared completely. That night, I packed all of my belongings and Kimmy's. I then destroyed what we couldn't take until every last trace of us had completely vanished from that house. I placed the divorce papers and the now empty forgiveness coupon box on the living room table. Then, taking Kimmy's hand, I boarded a flight abroad. The parent-teacher conference ended with polite, hypocritical applause. Alexander Morrison stood outside the classroom, basking in the grateful glances of Charlotte Clark and the sticky embrace of 5-year-old Pearl. The parents around them whispered in muted admiration, praising what they assumed was a devoted father shielding his family from an uncouth, jealous stranger. "Alex," Charlotte murmured softly, her eyes brimming with calculated moisture as she rested her hand against his tailored sleeve. "Thank you for today. If it weren't for you, I don't know what those vicious people would have said about my poor Pearl." Isabella was so cruel to orchestrate such a scene. Alexander's brows furrowed slightly. A strange, sour tightness gripped his chest, a phantom sensation that had begun the exact second Kimmy's small voice had uttered those 3 devastating words, "I'm sorry, Uncle Alex." He remembered the look in his daughter's eyes before she turned away. It wasn't the tearful, begging gaze she usually wore when he left her behind. It was flat, empty, like a mirror wiped clean of steam. "It's fine," Alexander said, pulling his arm away subtly under the pretense of checking his platinum watch. "Isabella went too far today. Bringing Kimmy to make a public scene, she's becoming unreasonable. I'll speak to her when I get back." "Will you come over for dinner tonight?" Charlotte asked, tilting her head with practiced vulnerability. Pearl was so frightened. "She keeps saying she wants Daddy Alex to tuck her in." Alexander looked down at Pearl, whose face was sticky with chocolate from the boutique treats he had bought her on the way to the school. Usually her childish demands stroked his protective instincts. Today, they grated on his nerves. "Not tonight, Charlotte," Alexander said, his tone firmer than usual. "I have matters to settle at home." He didn't wait for her pout or her protest. He summoned his driver, got into the Maybach, and stared out the tinted window as the city slid past. He convinced himself that Isabella was merely throwing a tantrum. In the 5 years of their hidden marriage, she had never truly defied him. She was quiet, accommodating, and patient when he demanded that she keep their marriage a secret. So Charlotte, who had returned from abroad with a broken heart and a sickly child, wouldn't be devastated. Isabella had swallowed her tears and nodded. When he forbade Kimmy from calling him Dad to prevent gossip, Isabella had only held their daughter tighter in the dark. "She won't leave," Alexander thought, loosening his silk tie. "She has nowhere to go. She loves me too much." When the car pulled into the driveway of the secluded villa on the outskirts of the city, the sun had already dipped below the horizon. The house was pitch black. Usually, no matter how late he returned, the warm amber glow of the porch light was left on for him. The kitchen would carry the faint aroma of simmered broth, and a pair of soft house slippers would be neatly set by the entryway. Alexander pushed open the heavy mahogany front door. "Isabella?" he called out, Clicking on the foyer light. Silence answered. A dense, unnatural silence that felt cold against his skin. He stepped inside. The air didn't smell like jasmine tea or home-cooked food.
It
Smelled like nothing. It smelled like an uninhabited concrete shell. Alexander walked into the living room, his leather shoes clicking sharply on the Italian marble floor. The room was pristine, too pristine. The plush, decorative pillows on the sofa were gone. The hand-knitted blanket Isabella had spent 3 months making during her pregnancy was gone. The framed sketches Kimmy had proudly taped to the lower half of the walls had been carefully peeled away, leaving only pristine blank paint. On the central glass coffee table, illuminated by the harsh chandelier, sat 2 items. A thick white envelope and a small, square wooden box. Alexander's throat tightened. He walked over, his steps suddenly heavy, and picked up the white envelope. Inside was a pristine set of legal documents. Divorce settlement agreement. Every clause was brutally clean. Isabella had waived all rights to the Morrison group's equity. She had waived spousal support. She had waived the luxury vehicles and the offshore trusts. She demanded only 2 things: the absolute, sole legal and physical custody of Kimberly Morrison and the relinquishment of any paternal claims by Alexander Morrison. At the bottom of the last page, Isabella's signature was penned in sharp, decisive strokes. Beside it was a small red fingerprint, Kimmy's tiny thumbprint, validating her mother's choice. Alexander let out a dry, incredulous scoff. Divorce? She thinks she can threaten me with this. His hand trembled slightly as he set the papers down and reached for the wooden box. It was the box he had given Kimmy on her 4th birthday, when she had sobbed uncontrollably after he left her at an amusement park gate because Charlotte had called claiming Pearl had a mild fever. To shut the child up, he had hastily printed out 100 green paper cards scribbled forgiveness coupon on each and told the 4-year-old, whenever Daddy does something wrong, tear one up. When they're all gone, you don't have to forgive me anymore. He had treated it as a cheap parenting trick, a game to keep a toddler quiet. Over the years, whenever he prioritized Charlotte, missed birthdays, or skipped school recitals, he would carelessly say, "Just tear one up, Kimmy. You have plenty left." Alexander opened the brass clasp. The velvet lining inside was completely bare. Not a single green coupon remained. Not even a speck of dust. In the bottom corner of the empty box, written in shaky, childish crayon, was a single sentence. "Uncle Alex, all the coupons are gone. Kimmy doesn't want a daddy anymore." Alexander's vision blurred for a fraction of a second. A violent, suffocating pressure seized his lungs. He dropped the box. It hit the marble with a dull, hollow clatter. "Isabella," he roared into the empty house, running toward the stairs. "Kimmy." He shoved open the master bedroom door. The walk-in closet was half empty. Every dress he had bought her, every piece of jewelry he had tossed at her as compensation for his absences, hung untouched with the tags still on. But her worn sweaters, her favorite linen shirts, and her sketchbook portfolios were gone. He rushed to the nursery. Kimmy's room was utterly desolate. The pink sheets were stripped from the mattress. The small wooden easel was gone. On the white desk where she used to practice writing his name in secret, there were no toys left behind. Except on the floor near the wastebasket, where Alexander saw tiny shreds of burnt paper. He dropped to his knees, his tailored trousers grinding against the floor, and sifted through the ash with trembling fingers. They were photographs. Every single picture of Alexander with Kimmy, the few candid shots Isabella had managed to take over the years, had been systematically cut into ribbons and incinerated. Not a single trace of his existence was allowed to remain in their lives. No, she's just throwing a fit," Alexander muttered, his voice cracking in the dark room. He pulled out his phone with slick, sweating palms and dialed Isabella's number. "The number you have dialed is currently out of service or has been disconnected." He dialed her sister. Disconnected. He called his personal assistant, his voice feral and breathy. "Track Isabella's credit cards. Track her passport. Find out which hotel she checked into. Now." 10 minutes later, the assistant called back, his tone terrified. "Mr. Morrison?" Madam closed all her domestic bank accounts at 2 o'clock this afternoon. She liquidated her personal savings and surrendered her domestic SIM card. As for her travel records, "Where is she?" Alexander bellowed, veins bulging along his neck. Her name appeared on the passenger manifest for a private charter flight that departed from the international terminal 3 hours ago. The flight plan had multiple transit stops. We can't trace her final destination. Alexander's hand went limp. The phone slipped from his grasp, crashing against
The floorboards.
the silence of the house surged back in, heavy as ocean water, crushing him. Where he knelt in the empty nursery. In the weeks that followed, Alexander did not sleep. He turned the city inside out. He hired the top private intelligence firms, dispatched investigators across Europe and North America, and spent millions attempting to track the private charter's flight path. But Isabella had planned her departure with surgical precision. She had utilized a blind trust, established by her late grandmother, a heritage Alexander had always dismissed as insignificant, to erase her digital footprint entirely. Meanwhile, the void in the villa became suffocating. Alexander found himself wandering into the kitchen at midnight, staring at the empty countertop where Isabella used to leave warm honey lemon water to soothe his chronic stomach pain. When he opened the medicine cabinet, he found it completely bare. Isabella had always been the one to organize his prescriptions, knowing the exact dosages by heart. Instead of facing the agony of the empty house, Alexander threw himself into work and allowed Charlotte to weave herself further into his daily routine. "Alex, you can't keep torturing yourself," Charlotte said one evening, walking into his penthouse office at the Morrison Group headquarters. She was dressed in an expensive haute couture gown, carrying a designer handbag purchased with the corporate card Alexander had carelessly given her to handle household expenses. "Isabella was ungrateful," Charlotte continued, resting her hands on his rigid shoulders. "You gave her a luxurious life, and she repaid you by creating a scandal and running away like a coward. Let her go. Pearl and I are your real family now. Look, I even brought Pearl's adoption papers for you to sign." Alexander stared at the legal forms Charlotte placed before him. Petition for sole paternal adoption. Pearl Clark to Pearl Morrison. A sudden memory, sharp as broken glass, struck his mind. 2 years ago, when Kimmy was 4, she had accidentally tripped over a rug and called out, "Daddy, it hurts." Alexander, terrified that a visiting business associate or Charlotte's friends might overhear, had dragged the weeping child to the front door in a fury. He had forced her to kneel on the cold slate tiles for 2 hours, demanding that she chant Uncle Alex 3,000 times until her voice was reduced to a raspy, bleeding whisper. Isabella had thrown herself over the child, taking the brunt of his harsh words, begging him to spare their daughter. "She's only 4, Alexander. She just wants her father," Isabella had cried. "She needs to learn her place," he had spat back then. "Until Charlotte's situation is stable, no one can know I have a child." Now, Charlotte was placing adoption papers in front of him with a serene smile, expecting him to name another man's child his sole heir without a second thought. "Where is Pearl's biological father, Charlotte?" Alexander asked, his voice dangerously low. Charlotte froze for a microsecond before her eyes filled with well-rehearsed
Tears.
"Alex, you know he passed away before she was born. Why are you bringing up my painful past now?" Alexander didn't answer. He looked at the woman he had placed on a pedestal for nearly a decade, the innocent white moonlight for whom he had sacrificed his own flesh and blood. The next morning, Alexander did something he had never dared to do before. He commissioned a full, covert forensic background check on Charlotte Clark's life abroad. The truth did not take long to surface. When money was no object, the darkest secrets were easily bought. 3 days later, a thick manila folder landed on Alexander's desk. Inside were medical records, bank statements, and overseas police reports. Charlotte's deceased husband was very much alive, a disgraced former venture capitalist named Julian Vance, currently serving a sentence in a federal prison in New Jersey for wire fraud. Pearl was not the child of a tragic romance. Charlotte had fled the United States when Vance's empire collapsed, taking the remaining hidden offshore funds. She had targeted Alexander upon her return, knowing his lingering adolescent guilt over their past breakup would make him an easy mark. Worse still were the transcripts of private messages recovered from Charlotte's encrypted cloud backup. There were conversations between Charlotte and the kindergarten teachers, where Charlotte had systematically bribed the staff to ostracize Kimmy, ensuring that Pearl took all the lead roles in school plays and received all the awards. There was a message sent to her associate just 3 weeks prior. "The Morrison idiot actually believes Pearl is sick every time I call him. His pathetic ex-wife looks like she's on the verge of killing herself. Once I get him to sign the adoption papers and secure the trust fund. I'll have enough to bail Julian out and settle abroad. Alexander's hands shook so violently that the papers scattered across his mahogany desk. A strangled sound tore from his throat. He had destroyed his own daughter's heart. He had forced his flesh and blood to call him uncle. He had stood on a stage and set off citywide fireworks for a con artist's child while his own daughter wept over a piece of torn green paper. In the dark, "Sir," his secretary called out tentatively, opening the office door.
Miss Clark is downstairs.
"She brought Miss Pearl to see you." Alexander slowly lifted his head. His eyes were entirely bloodshot, filled with a terrifying, hollow madness. "Bring them up," he whispered. When Charlotte entered the room, smiling radiantly, holding Pearl by the hand, she was met not with Alexander's usual warmth, but with 4 stone-faced corporate security guards and 2 uniformed police officers from the economic
Crime Division.
"Alex? What is the meaning of this?" Charlotte gasped, clutching Pearl closer as her face turned pale. Alexander walked toward her slowly. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things.
He
simply tossed the forensic dossier at her feet. The pages fanned out across the floor, exposing the photos of Julian Vance, the bank routing numbers, and the printed chat logs. Charlotte's breath caught in her throat. She dropped to her knees, scrambling to gather the papers, her pristine facade shattering instantly. Alex, listen to me. It's not what it looks like. Julian forced me. I had to protect Pearl." "Get your hands off me," Alexander said, his voice as cold as a tombstone as she reached for his trousers. "Daddy, Alex." Pearl wailed, terrified by the tension in the room. "Daddy, don't be mean to mommy." The word daddy sounded like acid poured directly into Alexander's ears. "I am not your father," Alexander snarled, looking at the child with an expression of pure revulsion. "And you will never step foot near my family again." He turned to the lead investigator. She embezzled $12 million through the shell companies she set up under the Morrison Group's nonprofit division. Prosecute her to the absolute maximum extent of the law. Freeze every asset, seize every luxury item bought with my funds, and ensure she never sees a single cent of bail. Alexander, no. You loved me. You promised to take care of us. Charlotte shrieked as the officers snapped handcuffs around her wrists, dragging her toward the door while Pearl's screams echoed down the corridor. Alexander stood alone in the center of the vast office. The silence returned. He sank into his leather chair, buried his face in his hands, and wept like a wounded animal. The retribution was swift and total, yet it brought not a single drop of relief, because the 2 people he had destroyed were no longer there to see it. 6,000 miles away, in the misty, cobblestone outskirts of Edinburgh, the autumn air carried the crisp scent of pine and wet heather. In the sunlit conservatory of an old Victorian stone manor, 6-year-old Kimmy sat on a plush velvet rug, carefully dipping a fine watercolor brush into a palette of cerulean blue. "Is that a bird, sweetheart?" a gentle voice asked. Kimmy looked up. Her cheeks, once pale and sunken, were now rosy and plump. Her light brown eyes, free of the perpetual fear that had haunted her early childhood, sparkled with vibrant warmth. "It's a sea eagle, Mom," Kimmy said, pointing her tiny brush at the canvas.
The
teacher at the art academy said sea eagles can fly across whole oceans without getting tired because their wings never give up. Isabella walked over, carrying a tray of freshly baked oat scones and warm elder flowertea. She wore a simple, elegant ivory cashmere sweater and dark trousers. The exhausted, submissive posture that had weighed her down for 5 years in the Morrison household was entirely gone. In its place was the radiant, formidable poise of a woman who had reclaimed her own destiny. Isabella was no longer just the hidden wife of a CEO. Returning under her maternal surname, Isabella Vance Sinclair had resumed her position as the chief creative director of the Sinclair Architectural Heritage Foundation, a prestigious European institution founded by her late grandfather. Within 6 months of her return, her restorations of historic Highland estates had won international acclaim, earning her features in architectural digests across the continent. She sat down beside her daughter, brushing a stray lock of soft hair behind Kimmy's ear. "You're an eagle too, Kimmy," Isabella said softly, kissing her temple.
"You
flew across the ocean with Mom." Kimmy smiled, leaning her head comfortably against Isabella's shoulder. There were no green coupons here. There was no man coming through the door demanding absolute silence. There were No forbidden words. When Kimmy made a mistake, spilling paint on the hardwood floor or dropping a teacup, she no longer dropped to her knees in terror, bracing for punishment. Instead, Isabella would simply kneel down, wrap her in a towel, and say, "It's okay, my love. Things can be cleaned. You are what matters." Through intensive art therapy and unconditional love, the scars on Kimmy's little heart were slowly, painstakingly knitting shut. One evening, while Isabella was sketching blueprints in the study, Kimmy walked in holding a small sheet of green paper she had found among her craft supplies. Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She froze, watching her daughter
Carefully.
Kimmy looked at the green paper, then looked at the crackling fireplace across the room. "Mom?" Kimmy asked quietly. "Yes, my treasure? Do you remember the coupons?" Isabella set down her drafting pen, her heart aching. "I do, baby." Kimmy walked over to the fireplace. She held the green slip between her small fingers. "Uncle Alex told me that if I ran out of coupons, he would be lost forever." "Are you sad that he's lost, Kimmy?" Isabella asked gently, ready to comfort whatever tears might come. Kimmy tilted her head, thinking seriously. Her young eyes were calm, possessing a clarity far beyond her years. "No," Kimmy said simply. "When he was here, it always felt cold. Now that it's just you and me, our house is always warm." With a flick of her small wrist, Kimmy tossed the green paper into the roaring
Fire.
The paper curled, turned to bright gold flame, and vanished into gray ash within seconds. Kimmy didn't watch it burn. She turned around and skipped back to the sofa to finish reading her storybook. Isabella closed her eyes, letting out a long, silent breath that felt like the final release of a 5-year nightmare. Her daughter was finally healed. While Isabella built a peaceful haven in the Scottish Highlands, Alexander Morrison's world was descending into utter ruin. The exposure of Charlotte's fraud had triggered an uncontrollable chain reaction. When the local media caught wind of the arrest, investigative journalists began digging into the Morrison family's private affairs. Then came the fatal leak. A parent who had attended the infamous parent-teacher conference uploaded a high-definition video of the incident to the internet. The footage was unsparing. Alexander Morrison holding Charlotte and Pearl like a proud patriarch, while a small, trembling girl in the corner pointed at him and cried, "Uncle Alex, over there is my dad." The video captured Alexander's cold, disgusted rebuke. "Whose child are you? Come over here and apologize to Pearl." The public backlash was swift, brutal, and apocalyptic. The Morrison Group, which had long cultivated a brand image centered on family values, integrity, and social responsibility, saw its stock price plummet by 40% in 3 days. Major international retail partners severed ties. The board of directors convened an emergency summit, demanding Alexander's immediate resignation as CEO. "You publicly disowned your legitimate, biological child to play daddy to an embezzler's daughter," the oldest board member roared, slamming a tablet showing the viral video onto the conference table. The Morrison Group's reputation is in the gutter. The Sinclair Foundation in Europe has just cancelled our joint luxury hotel development project, a $3 billion contract. Alexander sat at the head of the table, his eyes sunken, his designer suit hanging loosely off his emaciated frame. He hadn't shaved in days, gray strands had begun threading through his dark hair. "What did you say?" Alexander croaked, his voice raw. "Which foundation cancelled the contract?" "The Sinclair Heritage Foundation," the director shouted. Their chief architectural director personally signed the termination clause, citing moral bankruptcy of the Morrison leadership. Alexander's head snapped up. Sinclair. He remembered Isabella's maiden name, Isabella Vance Sinclair. He had always thought Sinclair was just a middle name she used on formal documents. He had never bothered to ask about her family, assuming she was just an ordinary art teacher he had met in university. Alexander bolted from the boardroom, ignoring the shouts of his executives. He sprinted to his office, grabbed his personal laptop, and accessed the global registry for the Sinclair Heritage Foundation. There, on the official press portal, was a recent photograph from an architectural gala in London. Isabella stood under the grand crystal chandeliers of the Victoria and Albert Museum, radiant in an emerald silk gown, receiving the gold medal for heritage conservation. Standing beside her was Kimmy, dressed like a little princess in a bespoke velvet coat, smiling brightly as she held her mother's award. Beneath the photo, the caption read, "Lady Isabella Sinclair, Chief Architect, accompanied by her sole heir, Miss Kimberly Sinclair. Kimberly Sinclair. She had stripped him of his surname. She had erased him completely. A wild, desperate fire ignited in Alexander's broken mind. She is there.
They
Are in the UK. I can find them. I can fix this. He called his remaining personal staff, his voice frantic. Book me on the first flight to London.
now.
The annual International Heritage Architecture Symposium was held at the Historic Assembly Rooms in Edinburgh. The grand ballroom was illuminated by hundreds of beeswax candles and crystal sconces. Aristocrats, world-renowned architects, and prominent philanthropists mingled over vintage champagne and classical chamber music. Outside the grand iron gates, the rain poured relentlessly. Alexander stood in the deluge, soaked to the bone. He had been denied entry by the security personnel. His clothes were drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale and feverish. In his coat pocket, wrapped in multiple layers of plastic to keep them dry, were 500 freshly handwritten green slips of paper. He had spent 3 sleepless nights writing them by hand, his fingers bleeding from cramps. Forgiveness coupon, valid for Alexander to be Kimmy's dad. Forgiveness coupon, unlimited use. Forgiveness coupon, I'm sorry. Please let me come. He looked like a ghost, a deranged beggar standing outside the gates of paradise. At 10 o'clock in the evening, the heavy oak doors of the assembly rooms opened. Guests began descending the grand marble steps under the cover of large black umbrellas held by valets. Then Alexander saw them. Isabella emerged from the entrance. She wore an exquisite midnight blue velvet cape over an evening gown, her hair swept up in an elegant chignon, her face glowing with quiet confidence and aristocratic grace.
Beside her walked a
distinguished, silver-haired gentleman, Lord Julian Sinclair, her granduncle, and between them skipped Kimmy. Kimmy was laughing, holding a small box of handmade Scottish fudge, her little leather boots clicking merrily against the stone. Kimmy. Alexander's voice tore through the rainy courtyard, shrill, broken, and
desperate.
He shoved past the stunned security guards, his expensive shoes splashing through puddles as he threw himself toward the steps. Kimmy. Isabella. Security guards immediately moved to intercept him, tackling him to the wet stone pavement just feet away from the grand staircase. Let me go. That's my daughter. That's my wife. Alexander screamed, thrashing against the guard's grip. His knees slammed into the hard gravel, tearing his trousers and drawing blood, but he barely felt the pain. He struggled upward, kneeling in the mud, holding out his trembling, soaked hands. Isabella stopped walking. The crowd fell silent, turning their eyes toward the unkempt, desperate man on the ground. Kimmy stopped as well. She stepped slightly behind Isabella's cape, peeking out at the commotion. Isabella looked down from the top of the steps. Her expression was neither furious nor triumphant. It was completely, utterly placid. It was the face of someone looking at a stray pebble on the roadside. Alexander, she said calmly, her voice carrying clearly over the patter of the
Then.
Isabella. Isabella, please. Alexander wept, tears mixing with the freezing rain streaming down his hollow cheeks. He reached into his soaked coat and pulled out the thick stack of green coupons, holding them up toward the child, like a man offering his soul to an indifferent deity. Kimmy, look. Look what Daddy brought you, he sobbed, his voice cracking into high, pathetic wheezes. I made them for you. 500, no, thousands of
them.
You can tear them up every day. You can tear them up for the rest of my
life.
Just call me Dad once. Please, Kimmy. Just give Daddy one more chance. The guests murmured in disgust and confusion, recognizing the fallen corporate tycoon who had disgraced himself across international headlines. Kimmy looked at the man kneeling in the mud. She looked at the wet green slips of paper falling apart in his trembling hands. There was no hatred in her big, light brown eyes. There was no lingering pain.
No tears. No se prest longing.
There was only the polite, distant curiosity of a well-bred child looking at a noisy stranger. Kimmy took a small step forward, standing beside her mother under the large, black umbrella held by the valet. She looked Alexander directly in his bloodshot eyes and spoke in her sweet, clear, melodic voice. Excuse me, mister. Alexander's breath hitched in his chest. His heart slammed against his ribs.
She's going to speak to me.
She's going to forgive me. My mom told me, Kimmy said, her tone utterly innocent and firm, that I shouldn't talk to strange uncles in the street. And all the green papers were thrown away a long time ago. They don't work anymore. She turned back to Isabella, tugging on the velvet cape with a sunny smile. Mom, can we go home now? Granduncle promised to read me the story about the Highland eagles. Of course, my love, Isabella replied softly, without sparing Alexander a single additional glance. She took Kimmy's hand, stepped into the waiting Bentley, and closed the door.
No, no, Kimmy.
Isabella. Alexander lunged forward, but the guards pressed him firmly back down into the
Mud.
The Bentley's engine purred to life. The headlights swept across the wet courtyard, blinding Alexander for a brief second before the sleek car smoothly pulled away, gliding out of the iron gates and disappearing into the Edinburgh mist. Alexander collapsed forward, his forehead pressing against the freezing, filthy
Gravel.
The rain beat down upon his back. The wet green coupons scattered across the puddles around him, their ink dissolving into illegible black smudges, swept away by the gutter water one by one. He had spent years forcing his daughter to call him uncle so another woman would never know she existed. Now his daughter had finally granted his wish. To her, he would forever be nothing more than a strange, nameless uncle crying in the rain, a ghost from a past that no longer had a right to exist.